Hey there, and welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to unpack a topic today that's a lot more nuanced than I think those self-help gurus make it seem, the ego.
And now, before you click away thinking this is just about arrogant hotshots, we're going way deeper than that today.
We're diving into some fascinating excerpts from Understanding Layers of Ego, a text that really flips the script on what we think we know about this whole ego thing.
Ready to get a little introspective?
Let's go. So right out of the gate, this text hits us with a definition of ego that honestly threw me for a loop.
A feeling of having an identity. Now, I don't know about you.
But when I hear ego, I picture like a rock star demanding green M&Ms backstage. You know, that whole I'm a big deal vibe.
Yeah.
But this definition suggests something much more fundamental is at play here. It's fascinating, isn't it? That definition goes way beyond just simple pride. It's about every single identification we carry, anything we cling to, outside of our true core selves. Each time you think or say, I am fill in the blank, you're tapping into a layer of your ego. It could be your job, your relationship status, your taste in music. It all falls under this umbrella.
Okay, so it's not just about bragging rights or being a know-it-all. It's about anything we use to define ourselves, even things that seem positive on the surface. Like, think about a parent beaming with pride over their child's accomplishments.
Most people wouldn't consider that a bad thing, right?
You've hit on a perfect example of how subtle this can be. In fact, the text even uses that exact scenario, identifying with our children, to show how the same situation can spark completely different reactions depending on the state of our ego. This is where it gets super intriguing and honestly, a little thought-provoking. The text explains how a child's success could trigger genuine pride in a parent, but it could also trigger possessive pride, or even flat-out jealousy.
And it all comes down to how much the parent identifies with the child's accomplishments as an extension of their own identity.
It's like that old saying, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. Our ego colors our perception of everything, even something as pure as a child's success. A pure mind, as the text calls it, experiences unadulterated joy for the child, no strings attached.
So in that ideal scenario, the parent is just genuinely stoked for their kid, no ego gymnastics involved?
Precisely. But here's where things get interesting. The text talks about how an impure mind might feel a sense of ownership over that success.
It's that's my kid kind of pride, where the ego is getting a little boost from someone else's achievements.
And then there's the dull mind, which the text says might feel threatened by the child's accomplishments.
It's like the parent's sense of self-worth takes a hit because their kid is out there crushing it.
And that, right there, highlights a crucial point about the ego.
Yeah.
It often seeks validation and security through comparison. When someone else's success feels threatening, it often points to a place of inner insecurity where our ego is clinging to the need to feel superior.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So if we're constantly filtering experiences through this lens of ego, how does that play out in our everyday lives? What happens when we start recognizing those ego-driven reactions in ourselves, the good, the bad, and the, well, kind of ugly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads us to a fascinating concept that this text explores. The choices we make in the face of these ego layers.
Yeah.
And get this, the text doesn't hold back. It talks about a whole spectrum, with goodness on one end and evil on the other.
Okay, now we're really venturing into some deep territory here. Good versus evil. I'm suddenly feeling like we need a dramatic soundtrack. But seriously, tell me more about this spectrum and how it connects to this whole ego thing. This is where I feel like things could get really insightful and maybe even a little uncomfortable.
I hear you. It does sound a little intense, doesn't it?
But don't worry, we're not suddenly talking about epic battles between superheroes and villains.
The text isn't suggesting we all have a little devil and angel on our shoulders battling it out for control.
Right.
It's much more about the everyday choices we make, the things we identify with the values we prioritize.
Okay, so those seemingly small daily decisions we make, those actually reveal a lot about where we fall on this spectrum at any given moment.
Precisely. Think of it like this. Every choice we make, however small, is like casting a vote for the kind of person we want to be.
Like, let's say you're scrolling through social media and you see a post from someone you secretly envy a little. Do you allow yourself to get sucked into that comparison trap feeling resentful or inadequate? Or do you choose to celebrate their success and move on with your day?
So even something as simple as hitting the like button or scrolling right past that's a tiny reflection of our ego at work.
Exactly. It's those subtle, almost unconscious choices that really paint a picture of our inner landscape.
And here's the catch. The text points out that most of us are caught in this constant tug of war between these opposing forces without even realizing it.
Yeah.
And that unawareness, that's where the ego thrives.
We go about our day reacting to situations based on these ingrained patterns of identification, and the cycle continues.
It's like we're on autopilot running these subconscious programs that dictate our reactions without us even realizing it. Have you ever caught yourself doing that? I know I have. Like getting annoyed at someone for something totally insignificant or feeling that pang of jealousy over something pretty ridiculous.
It's those moments that make you realize how sneaky the ego can be.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is that according to the text, humans have this incredible capacity to identify with practically anything from the noble and inspiring to the downright destructive.
Okay, so we're not limited to identifying with just the good or the bad stuff. We can latch onto anything, no matter how random or illogical, and build a whole identity around it.
Precisely. The human mind is incredibly adept at creating stories and identities based on whatever we feed it.
And the ego, being the master storyteller that it is, will latch on to anything that gives it a sense of security, validation, or even just a fleeting feeling of superiority.
So following that logic, even something as seemingly harmless as feeling a little superior when we receive a compliment, even that tiny blip on the radar could be a sign of our ego flexing its muscles, right?
Exactly. That's a perfect example of what the text refers to as taking the first step on that slippery slope towards more destructive patterns of behavior.
A slippery slope. I like that analogy. It's not like feeling a little proud of yourself once in a while automatically turns you into a villain.
Mm-hmm. But it's that initial identification with feeling above others, even in a small way, that can set a dangerous precedent.
Precisely. The text talks about how that feeling of superiority, even if it's fleeting, can create a kind of false euphoria.
And like any addictive substance, we end up craving that feeling again and again, often without realizing that it's our ego pulling the strings.
It's like our brain gets a hit of dopamine from feeling superior, and suddenly we're hooked. We crave that validation, that sense of being better than, and it can quickly spiral out of control.
You've hit the nail on the head. And as the text points out, this pattern ultimately leads to a sense of loneliness and a diminishment of our own self-worth.
Even if we convince ourselves that we're better than others, deep down, that constant need for validation eats away at our true sense of self. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. It's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down.
So if we're buying into this idea that feeding our ego, even in those subtle ways, can lead us down a pretty destructive path, what's the alternative? How do we break free from this cycle of constantly clinging to things that ultimately don't serve us? What's the path to climbing back up that slippery slope?
Well, the text offers a solution that on the surface might seem surprisingly simple: transcending the ego through the transformation of the mind with the help of the heart.
Okay, I'll admit that sounds a little abstract. What does that actually look like in our day-to-day lives? Does it mean we all need to quit our jobs and become monks or something?
Yeah. Exactly. It's not about changing our outward circumstances. It's about shifting our internal focus.
It's about moving away from needing external validation and those ego-driven desires we talked about, and instead cultivating inner qualities like compassion, empathy, and selflessness.
So it's like we're training our minds to detach from those external things we tend to cling to for validation, possessions, achievements, even other people's opinions.
Precisely. And instead of seeking validation from the outside, we start to cultivate a sense of wholeness and peace from within.
That's what the text refers to as connecting with our higher self.
Okay, so it's not about becoming some kind of superhuman or achieving some crazy level of enlightenment.
It's about aligning with our most genuine, compassionate, interconnected selves.
Exactly. And those practices we talked about, devotion, right action, knowledge, meditation, those become the pathways, the tools that help us chip away at the ego's grip and reveal that true self.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that understanding how our ego operates is crucial for growth.
And it's not about beating ourselves up for having an ego, we all do. It's about recognizing its influence in our lives and making conscious choices that align with our values and who we truly want to be.
Well said. Awareness really is the first step. Once we shine a light on those ego-driven patterns, we can start to make different choices.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought-provoking question to ponder as you go about your day. If we become what our minds cling to, what are we unconsciously clinging to in our own lives? What are those subtle ways we're allowing our ego to call the shots? That's something to chew on, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a lifelong journey of self-discovery.
This has been another fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time when we dive into another intriguing topic that'll have you looking at the world a little differently.